Boker Tov, everybody. It's nice to see you from all over the place. I love that the minhag of sharing where you're from used to be, a couple of years ago started with the request from the host, and now it's just the automatic practice. We could do a thing about where rituals come from, but it's nice to see that you guys are from lots of places. We have a good afternoon from Prague. Very nice. So we're a worldwide audience today. We're going to jump in. We're going to start with a question that the rabbis ask in Masechet Tubot, and then we're going to halfway through jump to a related question that they don't necessarily ask explicitly, but is implied in the logic of the page. You'll see when we get there how they might be related. And I thought it just happened. I'm going to juxtapose today two different texts on two different topics that I think actually fit nicely together. And if it weren't for that they fell in the same week, we might not have made this connection or noticed them in that way. So that's a little bit of an introduction. Introduction number two, before we turn to the question, the first text. We studied this past week a Mishnah that talks about the jobs that a woman who marries a man has to do for the household. The Mishnah brings a list of those jobs. It's part of the financial arrangement that they make through the ketubah. It's in exchange for being supported by the household of her husband's estate. She has to provide certain labor for the house. And one of those is the woman is obligated to nurse children that are born to the couple in the house. And the Gemara goes to an exploration of that topic, which says, well, what if they get divorced? Does she still have to nurse the child? Because on the one hand, it's still her child. On the other hand, it's no longer her, right? The obligation to nurse the child had to do with the marriage arrangement. And if the marriage arrangement is nullified, maybe she doesn't have to have a requirement to nurse the child anymore in the case of divorce. Not framed the way we would frame it in the modern setting, but that's how the rabbis framed it. But it leads to a conversation, which we're going to look at in a moment, because the rabbis say after the divorce, if the child recognizes his or her mother, the ex-husband can force his ex-wife to nurse the child, but he's required to compensate her. So once the marriage dissolves and this arrangement for nursing isn't part of the financial agreement the divorce settlement could be if the child recognizes the mom, she is compensated for the work of nursing that child. But it leads to a conversation about when do children recognize their mothers, at what age? So before we turn to the rabbis, let's turn that to the chat. If you have a sense, how old does a child have to be before they recognize who their mother is?
I've had 3. I'm not sure.
Stuart Brody says 6. I don't know if that means minutes, hours, or years. Before they are born, 2 to 3 months in the womb. A month at most, possibly a day. We have a range of answers. We'll wait for a few more if they're coming. And while you're typing those in and people are perusing them, I'm going to go to share screen. And then I'm going to start my slideshow. Rachel, do you have the link by any chance? I'm sorry, I meant to copy it.
I do. I'll pop it in the chat in 1 second.
So I got some slides today. If you're interested, we're going to put in the chat the link. Sorry, I forgot to copy it. You reminded me to do that at the beginning. Thank you. All right, so how old does a child have to be so that one can assume that they recognize their mother? That's the question. I gave you the context. This is the question. We saw our range of answers, and it turns out that the rabbis give us a range of answers too. And they are now on the screen. So Rava says that Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba said that Rav said 3 months. I saw 3 months as one of our answers. Shmuel says 30 days. Rabbi Yitzchak said that Rabbi Yochanan says 50 days. And Rav Shimi bar Abai said the halacha is accordance with what Rav Yitzchak said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, 50 days. So that we have a range of answers, right? 30 days, 3 months, 50 days. Different rabbis say different things. And the first statement of halacha codifies with what happens to be not the longest, but the middle answer, 50 days. But the Gemara a little later, still in our pages, says when Rami Bar Yecheskel came from Eretz Yisrael, he said that Shmuel said, whenever the baby recognizes her, meaning there's no fixed age for where this happens, meaning that different babies will start to recognize their mother at different times, and there isn't one particular time where this happens for all babies. There's a range, and we don't go by a measurement. We go by each baby. You have to test that out. You have to test that out actually yourself. And
Rabbi Goldberg, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the document is locked. Not everybody can get into it. Can you change the permissions on it?
Yes, I am.
By any chance, I'm sorry to interrupt the flow here.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
I apologize for that. Let me take care of that as quickly as I can here.
This page, while you're doing that, I'll mention this page reminded me of one we published, one we talked about like a week earlier, where the rabbis are talking about the curriculum for a child, which I thought was really interesting, when they should start learning Torah, when they should start learning Mishnah, when they should go to school at all. And there we also saw there were a variety of opinions, and they seem to come around to the idea that it really depends on the child, right? We had this really ambiguous statement like, someone's going to know it and I can't come up with it. If the child goes to school, his peers will run after him. Is that the statement? Somebody
that sounds familiar. We did just have that.
And there were two different interpretations. One is that it'll be very chaotic in the classroom and he'll just be running around. And the other is that his peers will be running to catch up with him because he'll be so far ahead in his learning.
Right. There was one side that I think was like on the bullying side, too precocious.
Yes, I mean young boys.
Yeah. Right. Right. But I think actually it is a larger halachic question. When there's a particular range a particular limit you're trying to set, do you set one for everybody or do you allow for individual differences? That's some of what's going on. Okay, I should have unlocked the document now. So if you have the
Although
link,
some rabbis did educate their daughters, Eleni. Some of them did.
Yes.
We do have some records of that.
We do have some stories of that in the Talmud, and that is true also. Okay, so we have this range. I'm going to go back to the script. We have this range, and we had a similar range in our answers. I'm going to go back to the slideshow. But before we talk about the range and like how, we're going to do a little developmental biology today too. The rabbis go on this principle that it could be individualized. They actually bring the following story, which says, right, a certain divorcee came before Shmuel and she didn't want to nurse her son. So this goes back to the context I gave you at the beginning. A couple's divorced. They have a young son. The husband wants her to still nurse the child, but the woman doesn't want to do that. We don't know anything of the context of the family or why, but she doesn't want to do that. And because the marriage has ended, the financial agreement isn't in place for her to necessarily have to do that. So what happens? He sends Rabdimi Bar Yosef to go and check her, right, the woman, and verify if the child recognizes her or not. So what did they do? He went and placed her in a row of women and took the son in his arms and passed him near them to see how the child would react. And when the child reached her, he looked at her face with joy. You could see the baby's face light up when they passed, right, the mother in this row of women. It's sort of like a lineup, right? Lahavdil, but it's like this police lineup, the mother lineup. And the woman like averts her eyes because she didn't want to make the eye contact with the child because she's trying to get out of this responsibility in the story. But Rav Dimi says to her, lift up your eyes, get up and take your son, right? You said you don't wish to do it, but your particular child passes the recognition test. And here's an interesting piece that the Gemara says about that. The Gemara asks, how does a blind baby know? Right? What happens if the baby's blind and they can't see the mother? And Rav Ashi says, well, actually, through smell and through the taste of the milk, there are other senses that a baby will use to recognize its mother. So I found this whole sort of run interesting. There's the piece about like the divorce and the woman, whose obligation to raise a child, and the woman doesn't want to do it. That like we've had a lot of that in Ketubot about this. But I thought the developmental biology piece here was really interesting, and I wanted to see like how closely did the rabbis get it in answering this question. So I went to the internet. I found some great academic papers that would take us a long time to go through. But given that we have a short time this morning, I found this great site from the Yale Baby School. It's some professors at Yale who run a site for mothers in New Haven who are having babies so that they can get all the resources you need about having a baby and what that means. And they have an article on the site that says, does my baby recognize me? And here's what they share. Look for things that the scientists in the 21st century are saying, and compare it with what the rabbis said in their century. So since the maternal voice is audible in the utero, an infant starts to recognize their mother's voice from the third trimester. So those of you who said like recognition starts in the womb, you're right there. The voice that they hear is muffled and low. Soon after birth, studies have shown that a baby will recognize their mother's voice and will expend great effort to hear her voice better over unfamiliar female voices. So there's some ways that the recognition starts early, and right after birth, right, we have indication that the baby knows who its mother is. A newborn's vision is pretty fuzzy. They can see just far enough away to perceive and study your faces when they're being held, assuming by you. In your baby's first few months of life, the faces that they see most are often yours. And given this exposure, your baby learns to recognize your face. And studies have shown that by 3 months of age, your baby can discriminate between their mother's face and the face of a stranger. So some of you said 3 months. Some of the rabbis said 3 months. That's true as well. And just on the last note at the end of the text, researchers have found that babies are able to discriminate between their mother's odors and the odors produced by either unfamiliar lactating females and females who have never given birth. And newborns begin to prefer their mother's odors, and this scent may even help calm or soothe your infant as well. So we see from this,
Ellie, did you see Susan's comment in the chat about, yeah.
I'm going to go back right now. The chat doesn't stay. If I keep the chat open, I can't see my own slides.
She says she wore a certain cologne after she gave birth for 12 days, and then she switched it up, and her daughter was confused and looked to her to check that it was the right one.
That was the right person.
Nursing.
Oh, there you go. That cologne, right? Since the baby had a perception of who the mother was, and then there was a change, right? So they didn't believe their eyes because they believed their nose a little bit. So anyways, what was interesting to me was that the time periods and the numbers, that the rabbis had lined up with what the scientists are telling us today. And this is a way this is a place where the rabbis get it right. The rabbis sometimes surprise me with their knowledge of biology. And that the fact that the different answers they give line up with some of these answers in the text, they're not far off. And given that they didn't have the same tools of research and the same tools of measurement, it's interesting that the knowledge that they had about when rabbis recognized the baby, when babies recognize their mother was similarly recognized by the rabbis as is by scientists today. So I see in the chat a couple questions, right? It's true, they don't discuss custody of the child. I think the assumption is, based on my read of the text, is the child stays in the father's home and doesn't go with the mother. But custody isn't the direct issue of this sugya. And the rabbis also don't talk about recognition of the father, but I believe too, from my own reading, although not in preparation for today, is that a father who's around a mother who, when the parents are together, the baby also recognizes the father's voice beginning in the womb because that's a voice that's been around. And proximity does make a difference. Right, so this was question number one, and this was a place where the rabbis got it, I think, pretty close, just so that we don't think that they always got it this close. I want to jump ahead a page. So I could do about, I left out a zero. 60b and 61a, a couple pages later. I'll add that zero back in for those of you who have Google access to the text. But just a few pages later, the rabbis tell us a woman who steps on donkey's dung when pregnant will have bald children, and one who eats mustard during pregnancy will have gluttonous children, and one who eats garden cress will have cheerful children. And it's eating meat and drinking wine during pregnancy that makes you have healthy children. And if you eat a lot of etrogim while you're pregnant, you'll have sweet-smelling children. What I love is a few pages after not being so off the developmental biology, we get a lot of folkisms that, to the best of my knowledge and research, right, don't have any backing in science, and we would not attribute stepping on donkey dung while pregnant to whether your children are born bald or remain bald or any of these things. In fact, today I would encourage no one to actually eat an etrog unless you grew it on a tree in your own backyard. Etrogim, which are citrus fruits, but grown mostly for ritual Sukkot purposes, the pesticide level in etrogim is pretty high, and it's actually unless you're actually growing etrogim for consumption as opposed to for Sukkot, you shouldn't eat them at all, and potentially could be dangerous to you and your children. But anyways, in contrast to those first texts where the rabbis has some sense of how biology works, we also see opinions more common to the ancient world where there are folkisms and other superstitions about connection between what you eat and how your children turn out. Now, we still have some of these things today, and depending on who your doctor is, if you're pregnant, you might get advised to avoid sushi or not, or other food, right? There's a limit about when during pregnancy it's okay to have a glass of wine and when you should have no alcohol whatsoever, and you should defer to your medical professionals on those. So we still do think about the health of a baby based on what a mother eats while she's pregnant, but this goes more to their psychological character, and it's, I think, more distant from where things were. Anyway, so that's topic number one. Topic number two comes from nearer to the end of the week. This is my version of a question that the rabbis are asking. It's not stated explicitly, but it says, after how long of being away does a person no longer recognize their family, or maybe vice versa? So we're going to go to a different part of the life cycle in a different context. And actually, if you've read these pages already, you'll know the rabbis are talking about a new Mishnah, which is about how frequently is a couple required to have intimate relations in marriage, and the Mishnah says it varies based on the occupation of the father. But someone who's traveling for business because they work on a ship or they're a trader won't be home as often, and there's a different interval from someone who's more local. And the rabbis say Talmidei Chachamim, people who are studying Torah, have a requirement to be intimate with their wives once a week, assuming that you're going to return home for Shabbat. And then the Talmud turns to a whole series of stories about rabbis who stay away studying Torah. I mean, you might say that the question in this text is about what's more important, spending time with your family and your spouse or studying Torah. And that's a context this comes up in. But in contrast to the story about when do children start to recognize their parents from a young age, I think the Gemara in these stories brings up the question, when are you away so much that your families no longer recognize you? There's a whole series of stories. If you like Talmudic stories, we haven't had them in a long time. This is a great page for some of them. We're going to look at two connected ones. I'm going to read us through them because it's a little longer, and then we'll have a chance to chat about it in the few minutes we'll have left at the end. So Rabbi Hanania ben Chakinai went to the study hall at the end of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai's wedding. So he attended his friend's wedding, and then he went off to study. Rabbi Shimon said to him, wait for me until I can come with you. Right? Don't go right after the wedding. I'm going to have my wedding celebration for a week. I'll come with you in a week. But Rabbi Hanania ben Chakinai so much wanted to study. He couldn't wait a week for his friend, and he went off to the study hall. He did not wait, and he sat 12 years in the study hall. He was gone from home for 12 years. By the time he came back, we'll see what how his family responds, but all the paths of his city had changed, and he didn't know how to get home. Right? Has that ever happened to you? You go back to a city where you used to live. Thank God for Waze or Google Maps. Like if the roads change, you can lose your way. There wasn't this educational. There wasn't this helpful tool for us for the rabbis. They didn't have Waze or Google Maps yet to be able to do that. He came home. He couldn't find his house. So what did he do? He sat on the bank of the river and he heard people calling out to a certain girl, daughter of Chakinai, fill your pitcher and come up. So he's sitting by the river and he hears people calling out to someone, the daughter of Chakinai, it's your turn to get water from the river. And he says, I can conclude from this that this is our daughter. He says, maybe this is my kid. Right? So he doesn't recognize her 12 years later and he follows her to his house. Bum, bum, bum. This time it worked out. The page break comes at it's good time for a commercial, right? What happens when he gets
Do you think he even knew he had a daughter? I remember seeing this on the page a few days, and I wasn't sure if he doesn't recognize his daughter or he might not even know he has one.
Both are good. I think, Rachel, those are both possible. And when you read this whole list of stories, your imagination could go to lots of places about what were these people thinking and what's going on, right? Not only did he not recognize her, he might not even have known that she existed. He was gone for 12 years. No FaceTime, no Google Maps, and no FaceTime either. So, maybe there were letters back and forth, but not so much communication. So his wife was sitting and sifting flour in the house, and she lifted her eyes up when he came into the room and saw him, and her heart fluttered, and she passed away. Rabbi Hanania said before God, Master of the universe, is this the reward for this poor woman? Hanania says to God, oh my God, I've been gone for 12 years, and I finally come home, and what, you make the shock kill her? And he pleads for her mercy, and a miracle happens, and she comes back to life. So whether this is a revival of the dead or maybe she just passed out, the original text does say she passed away, that she died and came back to life, but it could be, if this is an actual incident, or maybe in other tellings of the story, that she fainted and came back. Right? So he doesn't maybe know, or he definitely doesn't recognize his daughter. He can't get to his house, and when he gets there, the shock of his return causes his wife to pass out or maybe pass away. Connected story number 2, Rabbi Chama Bar Bisa went and sat for 12 years in the study hall. And when he came back to his house, he said, I will not do what the son of Chakinai did. So he knew this story. He said, I was 12 years in the study house, but I don't want anyone to pass out or die. I'm going to do this differently. So what did he do? He went and sat in the study hall in his hometown. So he came back for 12 years, and he went to the study hall in his hometown and sent a message to his house that he was local. So he came home. He didn't walk into the house. He first went to study in the local yeshiva, and he said, I'm here. I'm at the local yeshiva. I'll be home later. Don't pass out when I walk through the door. And while he was sitting there, his son, Rabbi Oshaya, whom he did not recognize, came and sat before him. So here it says did not recognize, but Rachel, your question is probably good here. Did he know he had this son? And Rabbi Oshaya asked him questions about halakha, and Rabbi Chama saw that the halachot of Rabbi Oshaya were incisive, meaning that he was very sharp. So he's sitting in the Beit Midrash. A young rabbi comes to talk to him. They're discussing halakha, and the dad, not knowing he's talking to his son, says, "Hey, this is a sharp yeshiva bacher that I'm talking to." Rabbi Chama becomes distressed and he says, "If I had been here, if I had stayed at home and taught my son, I would have had a child like this." He says, "Woe to me," with some regret, if I had been here, my son could have turned out this way because I could have trained my son to be such a good Talmid Chacham. So then Rabbi Chama went to his house and his son went in with him. And so he gets up to leave, and it turns out the guy he was studying with goes with him. And not only that, they enter the same house. So Rabbi Chama stands up before him to honor a Torah scholar. which is the minhag of the day, the custom of the day. You would stand up when your teacher came in. Rabbi Chama stands up for the honor of this teacher he met in the local yeshiva. And since he thought he wanted to ask him a matter of halacha, he was going to ask him more questions. And his wife says, is there a father who stands up before his son? So Rabbi Chama was successful. His wife doesn't pass out, but he doesn't recognize his son. And when he stands before him, as you would before your teacher, his wife gives him rebuke. What are you doing? We don't stand before our own children in that way. Children stand before their parents. Here's an example of two examples in these stories of going off to study in the yeshiva and being gone 12 years and going back to that question, how long does it take before your family doesn't recognize you? Well, potentially 12 years. That's the magic number in these two stories. You'll see 12 in the next story about Rabbi Kiva and some other lengths of time in stories from before. So anyways, I found it as I was reviewing these pages of this week, I found it interesting that there were two different sets of texts that talked about what makes family members recognize each other. The first one was an emphasis on when in early childhood development does that start to happen. But as people said, some of the recognition of parents comes with proximity. Right, both the Yale Divinity School said that. The Yale Divinity School. That's what I'm used to talking about. The Yale, now I forgot what it was. The Yale Baby Center.
Child Study Center.
Thank you. And they say that. The rabbis in the Talmud said that, and some of you said that. And now we see the lack of proximity through childhood makes it so that parents no longer recognize their children, and the children no longer recognize their parents, and the reunion could be shocking to the family system. Right, and it's not metaphorical. It's not like, oh my God, my child grew up and I don't recognize them anymore. Like that's a phrase we might say today. This was like literally, they didn't recognize them. They were in actual proximity to their kid and wasn't sure it was them. Charles notes, the wives still recognize their husbands, right? Maybe in adulthood, there is still that recognition after that time. There is that, right? And there's physical recognition, but then they had, in each of those stories and the others we see on this page, there's the work that the family has to do to make itself a family again. And what's interesting in this discussion, if you like these stories, I encourage you to go to this run of stories that begins on page 60. There's a whole series of stories of rabbis who spend more than 1 week at the Beit Midrash, with or without permission of their family. Somewhere it turns out well, and somewhere it turns out not well. And it becomes, I think it's this real debate, not just about how long are you supposed to be away for, but what are the limits to balancing family and Torah? And we know the rabbis in other places say, right, Talmud Torah, the study of Torah is the ultimate mitzvah, but it's there are limits to it, and these texts hint at family is important too. You need to be around to be part of your family.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the rabbis have found a problem in their own system, like they've set up this system where Torah and Torah's study is this ultimate good. And it is so elevated that how could we say anything? And then they test the limit of that theory, right? This theory that there is nothing above Torah study. And the ideal is to study Torah at all times, and more Torah, more good. And then these stories really come to point out that there's a limit to that logic.
Yeah.
And it seems like they're wrestling with that. And I'm so glad you brought these today, because we brought different ones in the pieces that we shared over email over the last week, right? We did Rav Rachumi, which Ruth Calderon famously used that story in her opening speech, her maiden speech to the Knesset, which created quite a stir. And then, of course, we did the Rabbi Akiva story at the very end, which is the most famous one.
Yes.
So thank you for bringing the ones in the middle, some of the ones in the middle, so we can see those too.
See the list. Yeah, it's also interesting. We didn't have time for this, but there's a lot of new scholarship about the role of these stories in deciding law. Like the traditional scholarship of the Talmud differentiates between the legal passages and the narratives, and more contemporary scholars are pointing to, actually, these narrative pieces are there as part of the legal discussion, and they're not separate categories. And so looking at the narratives and how they shed light on some of the legal principles is not just critique, but part of the Talmud's way of working these things out.
Yeah. For my money, the majority of the time when the story comes along, it's pointing out a problem with the legal stuff.
Yeah. Many of them.
They spend all this time on the legal stuff. They think they've got it sorted out, or maybe they haven't. That legal reasoning has taken them only so far. And then they bring this story that shows there's more depth to what's going on and the legal reasoning. And it points up the weakness of the legal reasoning. A lot of the time, that's what's going on with these stories. Which was part of what makes the Talmud such an interesting text. Its approach to law is so complicated and rounded.
Yeah.
It's really sophisticated, and it's part of what makes it interesting. All right, we are at time, so we got to go. Thank you for the discussion, Rabbi Goldberg. Thank you to all of you for your participation in this discussion, for being a part of this community. Always lovely to see you all across the globe on what is, for me, Thursday morning. And well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We'll see you in your inbox tomorrow, and we'll see you in the space a week from now.
All right. Take care, everybody. Okay. Shabbat Shalom. Thanks, Rachel.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.